and welcome to our Capital Series event with Assemblymember Buffy Wicks. My name is Kristin Connelly. I'm proud to be the President and CEO of the East Bay Leadership Council. We're a regional employer advocacy organization seeking to improve economic vitality and quality of life. This is being recorded. You should know that. Our format today is that we are going to give Assemblymember Wicks 5 or 10 minutes, however long she wants to take, to outline some of her legislative priorities, and then we'll just dive into a moderated Q&A. For those of you who've been with us for my recent conversations with some of Assemblymember Wicks colleagues, you know the format. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom in order to do that. And so I'm just going to make a couple quick announcements, and then I'll introduce Assemblymember Wicks and we'll get started. So I definitely want to thank the leading members that we featured on our scrolling slides. You make everything that we do possible. So thank you to all those leading members, whether you've been with us for years or you're new. Also wanted to just thank, we have a handful of elected officials from across Assemblymember Wicks District and other places across the East Bay. Thank you for being with us. Our relationships with you are at the core of our ability to affect policy change. I did want to just recognize BL Moore, who is the Community and Government Relations Manager for Republic Services in Richmond, based in Assemblymember Wicks District 15. She took over the gavel from Ken Mintz on July 1st, and we're excited about BL's leadership this year. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in and do a very quick intro for our featured guest, and then pass it over to her. Assemblymember Buffy Wicks represents the East Bay in the California State Assembly, elected in 2018 and then re-elected in 2020. Her district spans the communities of Oakland to Richmond and includes the city of Berkeley. Assemblymember Wicks' work in the Assembly focuses on housing, expanding the social safety net, protecting consumers' privacy, and championing the rights of women and working families. Governor Gavin Newsom signed 8 of her bills in her first year in office, and despite the challenges brought on by the COVID pandemic, signed 7 of her bills into law last year. A lifelong community organizer, Assemblymember Wicks previously served on both of President Barack Obama's campaigns and worked for him in the White House. She lives in Oakland with her husband, Peter, and daughters, Jojo and Ellie. Without further ado, I turn over the program to Assemblymember Wicks. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I was looking through the participant list, and sounds like there's some old friends on there, some friendly faces, and some new folks who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet. So thrilled to be here with you all today. I'll just take a couple minutes. Would love to just more center the conversation around Q&A because I prefer hearing other folks instead of just talking at people, which maybe makes me not like a lot of other elected officials, or I don't know, who knows. But that was not a nice thing to say. I do love my colleagues, I will say, but sometimes we can like drone on and on and on. I'll walk through just a couple of things and sort of how I've approached this year as a legislator. You know, when we came back this year, we came back to a lot of uncertainty. We were unsure what the budget environment was going to look like. We were unsure, you know, wasn't everything unsure? The world was turned upside down, thinking about how COVID was going to hopefully come to an end and we were going to see our way out of this thing, which sort of is a little bit of fits and starts. But thinking about what are the biggest needs and what are the things sort of I've learned as a legislator in my first term that I can apply to this year, and then coming out of COVID, what's the work I can do? So a couple of things that I've been focused on. One is EDD. You know, we had really big issues around EDD and around folks claiming their unemployment insurance. And you know, I'm a big believer, I'm a Democrat. I think government can be there to help people. In order to have those beliefs and those values, it also means when something's not working, we have to fix it. We have to make sure government's helping people. And so I did a bill, and I'm still working on a bill that would help to establish an Office of Claimant Advocate, so folks could have an additional place to go if they were experiencing issues and challenges. And there's a handful of us legislators that have been doing a series of bills around EDD, both looking at the fraud and abuse, as well as the issues around folks being able to access their unemployment insurance. So that's been an ongoing conversation in the legislature and with the governor's office and publicly. I will continue to push on that and continue to hope that you know, my constituents will get the services that they need. And I should say this actually at the top, when I was thinking about my legislative priorities, one of the things that drives me in that is every night I get an email in my inbox of all of the constituent outreach that has come our way in my office, either through email or calls. And some of the stories that I've heard over the past year and a half have been truly heartbreaking, of what people have experienced through the pandemic, whether it was folks concerned about losing their homes, to small businesses being shut for good, to our early childhood care providers closing their doors, to people not being able to get their unemployment insurance, across the board at every sector. It's been tough. While at the same time, I've seen really moments of inspiration and hope of people coming together to help each other, sort of representing the best that I think our community here in the East Bay has to offer. And so that has informed a lot of my thinking as a legislator. In addition to EDD, I've worked on a couple bills around what our leave policies look like. And I've had a lot of conversations with the business community. I have a bill, AB 1041, called the Chosen Family Act, which I'll be honest, this is the group of employers. It was on the job killer list of the Chamber of Commerce. And I sat down and talked to the chamber about how can I make this bill more palpable for employers. We want to make sure that we're creating policies that both allow and honor and update our thinking around paid leave and unpaid leave and paid sick days, while at the same time ensuring that our employers have the ability to follow through with it. And so I negotiated with them over many times and was able to get it off the job killer list. And that's just also sort of part of my approach as a lawmaker, to think about how are we taking into account all different sides of the equation to sort of create good public policy. And so that bill, where it stands, and hopefully it'll get out of the Senate Appropriations, is, in California, we actually have a pretty antiquated system of who's allowed to take leave. And it's basically, are you married to the person, or are they, an immediate relative, a mother, father, daughter, son, etc. And this would allow folks to have what we're calling one designated person that you could take leave for, and which really helps our LGBTQ communities, as well as new immigrant communities and others who live in either multi-generational housing or things like that. So it's a bill that I think is important, and it was born again out of stories that I'd heard during the pandemic, of what people were experiencing and how they weren't or were not able to take leave. I've also done a bunch of work, and I did a second bill this year all around consumer protections around the debt settlement industry. And this is an industry, I'm sure you've seen the advertisements, consolidate your loans here, we'll negotiate your debt down. And while many of those companies are good companies doing good work for people, there's also some bad actors there. And it's a relatively unregulated industry. And so I've spent the last couple of years working in that space, and have put forth, I think, some really important reforms to that space. Especially, I knew kind of coming out of COVID, there will be people who would have gone into significant debt. And the last thing we want them to do is to have even more financial instability with working with some of the bad actors in the space. And so hopefully that bill will get signed into law by the governor. But that's another one that I've been working on. And then, I'm constantly working on housing legislation. It's a big issue that I care about. I was really proud last year when we did a housing package that we sent, that we were pushing through the assembly. Only 3 of the bills made it to the governor's desk, but 2 of them were mine. And so I was proud to have done that. And I'm a big believer both in doing housing production. We have to build more housing to make sure that we, bring down the cost of housing, but we also need to do everything we can to protect our renters. And often I think those two sort of camps of housing end up being bifurcated and almost in opposition to each other. And I think we need to do, it's a yes and, in my opinion. And so have some housing bills as well that we're going to continue to move through. And then the other bill that I took over this bill for Rob Bonta, my colleague, when he left us to go on, he left the little people to go on and be the Attorney General, which we're obviously very proud of him. But he had a bill that I took over, which would create working with Caltrans to create a bus lane for the bridge. Which is, it's kind of shocking to me we don't have it, to be honest with you, but I think it's really important. If you look, I mean, you all know, right? Like the I-80 corridor, it becomes a parking lot. And obviously in COVID, that all was sort of reduced, and we saw traffic being reduced, and all of a sudden like birds and butterflies everywhere because we were like not driving so much, and the natural environment sort of started taking over, which was great. But sadly, we're back to, traffic congestion. So that's another important bill. That's now a 2-year bill, but one that has been really fun to work on. And then the last thing I'll just say, in terms of policy, I'm a big supporter of our violence prevention intervention programs that we have here, and support a lot of the local CBOs that are doing direct gun violence reduction work. And so I championed a significant budget increase for those programs. We've seen a huge rate of gun violence in our communities, frankly, across the country. And we know one of the ways that we can combat that is these violence intervention and disruption programs. And so hopefully those programs will be funded more significantly now. We've got great programs here in the East Bay, Advanced Peace and Youth Alive and others that are doing tremendous work in this space. So that's another issue area I care about. And just broadly speaking, work on housing, work on homelessness issues, issues that impact women and children. I'm a mom of a 4-year-old and a little girl who turned 1 yesterday. So I've got 2 under the age of 5, and they're the most important things to me. So I center a lot of my work and advocacy in my own experience with them as a mom. And that drives a lot of my thinking as a policymaker. And so that's also reflected in a lot of the work that I've been doing in the legislature. So those are some of the top lines. There's a lot more to that. I've also, I don't know if you noticed in the last week, if you follow me on Twitter, but I really jumped into the fray to the vaccine movement and sort of poked the bear and been pushing for urging employers to require proof of vaccination for their employees and urging businesses to do the same, which I feel pretty strongly about, given the fact that we are now seeing a surge in the Delta variant. And I'm sure many of you saw the East Bay Times had an article about we would be in the purple tier if we had this tier system. And if you remember, the purple tier was when our schools were shut and our indoor dining was shut and all these other things. And I do not want to go back to that. And so I did a call to action last week on Twitter around urging employers and businesses to require proof of vaccination, and have been pretty busy in that space in the last 7 to 8 days, having that conversation, which has warranted some interesting dialogue on social media, but stuff that I think is actually really, really important. So those are some of my sort of top lines of some of the work that I've been doing as your rep here in the state legislature, doing my best to represent the progressive values of the East Bay. And with that, I'm happy to start having a moderated conversation here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Assemblymember Wicks. I am reminded of what we experienced with you when we did our joint East Bay Advocacy Day. The last time we did that was 2 years ago, which feels like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
When we were in the Capitol pre-pandemic. You are so substantive and covered a whole lot of territory in those remarks. So I too am a fast talker. I think you and I actually have a ton in common. But thank you for
talker.
that.
I know. I apologize.
No, it's fine. People are keeping up, and they expect that, at least from anything that involves me. So I did want to, in particular, I love that you commented about the chosen family bill and your work with the Cal Chamber to fix that. I mean, I had a similar experience. I co-chair a statewide coalition called the Real Coalition of my counterparts around the state. And we had a similar conversation with Lorena Gonzalez when we met in San Diego a couple of years ago. And she said, look, I'm going to come at this from a different place, perhaps, than you, but I want to make sure it is as effective as possible if my legislation passes. And I think that there is because the pandemic affected everyone and it affected employers who care deeply about their employees, I think it's really important that we can come together on those things. So I just think that just a little hat tip about your approach there, which I think is really helpful. I did want to just, we're going to go to the Q&A in a minute, but I did want to just have you elaborate for a little bit about housing and about homelessness. And so, there is this focus on some of the remaining housing bills that have not yet passed, or they may, and are kind of in limbo, and maybe there'll be some action later in the session. But there's a real, I've been in this role for a little more than 7 years now, and the entire time I've been in this role, employers have thought that housing is the most important thing for us to be working on and dealing with. And honestly, the state of California has not built enough housing ever since I was, born in Kaiser Walnut Creek. And so I just would love to get your sense about what you think is possible, what you think are sort of remaining barriers, and how can we be helpful, and then take a minute to talk about our unsheltered population and what's going on with homelessness, because that is such a failure as a society.
Totally. Okay, so I could spend like 5 days on those topics, but I'll try to answer them as thoughtfully as I can in the short time we have. On the housing front, you have done quite a few bills in this space. I think we have it's not a sort of Democrat versus Republican issue, right? I think you have a couple of things going on. Some of the needs I think are going to be really important is we need zoning reform. I'm a believer that in our transit sort of rich areas, we should be having more dense housing. So like I live in Rockridge, right? And on, College Avenue next to the BART stop, if you're at the BART, Rockridge BART, and you look back to the Zachary's Pizza, which of course everyone knows, it's one story. That should be 4 or 5 stories of housing, but one of the challenges that we have is zoning reform, and the fact that basically multifamily housing has been more or less illegal in California for the last 40 or 50 years. And so we have to create more multifamily housing, in my opinion. And I think I'm a believer in using the current footprint that we're using, and instead of sort of creating housing as far as the eye can see out to Stockton and Tracy in our open spaces, the areas with which we already have housing, let's densify some of that housing, especially around places where we have public transportation. One of the bills that's currently in the legislature right now is SB 9, which is Tony Atkins' bill, which would basically allow for duplexes. And if any of you sort of witnessed end of session last year, I spoke out on this bill with my 4-week-old in my arms on the floor of the assembly, which sort of spurred this really crazy sort of viral moment that I totally didn't anticipate. But I was speaking out about the same bill that we had passed then. And, I sit on housing committee, and we heard this hearing a couple of weeks ago for SB 9, which would, again, all it would do would be allow for duplexes. We're not talking about 10-story buildings. We're talking about duplexes in pre-existing lots. And we had so much opposition to the bill and so much controversy around the bill. And I want to provide a thoughtful analysis as to why, and it's hard for me to understand the sort of backlash against those types of bills, because I think that's exactly what we should be doing. I support duplexes, I support triplexes, quadplexes, larger units on avenues like College Avenue and things like that. And so it's just incumbent upon us in Sacramento. I mean, the premise of your question is correct. We have been failing on this issue. I will do everything I can to continue to push the needle. We do have some great, housing champions, David Chu and Scott Wiener, and our very own Nancy Skinner, who pushes on this issue. But that is critical. In terms of the homelessness issue, we thought that we were going to have, when we came back this session, we were going to have these massive budget, hits we were going to have to deal with. And it turns out we ended up having significant resources, and the governor just put in a lot of money into funding homelessness. And the goal being, hopefully we can take things like Project Home Key and convert those into longer term sustainable housing. But the truth of the matter is we have a serious need for long-term permanent supportive housing. And I know the business community has dealt with this significantly, and I've seen it in my own neighborhood and neighborhoods across my district, where you have folks who they need wraparound services, which is it's not cheap, but it's not a majority of those that are homeless. It's a minority, but they're the folks that we see most visibly that are in really serious need. So they need those resources. So hopefully with things like Project Home Key, which will continue to be funded, we can have those wraparound services. And I know a lot of cities have been struggling with how to handle this. Oakland, Libby set up the Tough Shed program. I mean, cities are looking for these types of solutions, but it fundamentally comes down to more resources into our mental health and drug and alcohol treatment, and more funding for wraparound services, and more housing across the board, period, especially for your very low income. But if you look at the cost of building, it's so incredibly expensive. So we have to come up with more innovative solutions. But I do think with this budget and what the governor just put in terms of these big resources, fingers crossed, we can pump that money in starting as soon as possible, because I see it as well. And we're confronted with it a lot, and it's really heartbreaking to see the pain and suffering that people are going through, and what folks are dealing with. But there have been more increased resources.
Yeah, no, I mean, and so much of how our work has changed at the East Bay Leadership Council is to deal with the impacts of the pandemic that were so uneven and really fell disproportionately on low income and communities of color and underserved communities. And so I have an entirely different job than I did pre-pandemic. And there's just so much work, because I believe that the East Bay will be fundamentally undone by the wealth gap. if we don't get
Yeah.
serious about how much poverty, how much uncertainty, and how people are living. So I appreciate you commenting about the need to densify. I have a lot of conversations about the fact that there's a difference between living at high density and being overcrowded, because when people try to counter. But I would say that there is a rise of Nimbyism in Sacramento and having more power in Sacramento than before, that I just, if there are ways we can be helpful in pushing back, I would love to do that.
Yeah, there are organized neighborhood homeowner association groups that they call their members, and they're on the phones every single day when any of these bills come up. And I've seen it, right? And homeowners vote. And so members pay attention to what they say. And so that's, and there's also, I think in California in particular, there's this sort of idea that like single family homes are like sacrosanct, right? That like, this is sort of, and this is literally like, Berkeley is literally the birthplace of the single family home. Like that is where that zoning came from. And that is rooted in exclusionary racist housing policy, you know? And now like Berkeley's trying to undo it, Oakland's undoing it. And we're all kind of having a real hard conversation about this. But I was listening to the SB9 debate, and there was an organization called Save Our Single Family Homes. Like that's literally what it's called, right? There's just this desire, I think, by many to sort of, you know, let's keep it the way it is. And I don't want to see any change in my neighborhood, and, you know, that kind of sentimentality, when the reality is what that leads us to exclusionary housing policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
In my opinion.
No, I mean, the complete disappearance of California starter homes and people able to get a foothold, right? That adds to the wealth gap and all kinds of trouble. I know that I grew up in a house that my dad built with his own hands with other people. They split up a lot, 3 families building it themselves. They met at a co-op preschool. So you know, there are some beautiful things about this Golden State, but we got a lot of work to do. Okay, so switching a little bit to talk about transportation. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned your bill and your commitment to carrying forward the idea of getting a dedicated bus lane. I know that's something that you've put some time and some shoulder, and so there were, so there's a question from AC Transit about how can we support your efforts on AB 455 to bring transit-only lanes back to the Bay Bridge. So feel free to answer that, but just also to comment a little bit about your vision for, and I'm sorry if you already covered this, we had a little technical delay at our global headquarters. You'll notice I have a little different background, but just to talk about transportation and getting people back onto public transportation. You know, you can assume in your question that we will get past COVID, but I just think that LA has sort of outpaced the Bay Area in terms of how we've progressed on transportation. There's a lot of accessibility and shared apps. It's easy to hop from one system to another in LA in ways that we still can't do here. So I'd just love to comment specifically about the transit only lane and then your vision for transportation.
Yes, and I see Ryan from AC Transit is on the chat. So I have the bill that, as I mentioned, that Bonta, and I sort of feel like Rob and I were fighting to do that bill, and then he got it. I really wanted to do it, and then he went to go be AG, so I took it over. So it all worked out in the end. But I think when you think about public transportation, people think, oh, we need to build more BART, and BART is important and we need to make sure we can support it. But the thing that we can do more affordably now and more easily now is really invest in our bus system, which is it's cheaper from a public policy point of view. It's more flexible, and we have the ability to enact that kind of change very quickly, right? And so it's part of the reason why I was excited to do this bill to work with Caltrains to create a bus lane. And I think if we make our buses constantly reliable, affordable, and on time and on schedule and fast, people will use it. That's the reality. People will use that if it works. It has to be reliable. It has to be consistent, especially for low-wage workers who need to be at work at a certain time that have no flexibility from their bosses. So that bill is currently a 2-year bill. We made it a 2-year bill because we had still some more dialogue to work through with a lot of the stakeholders. So it was going to require a little bit more time to do it the right way. I was sort of bummed to have to make it a 2-year bill, but it is what it is. And it just means, it'll get signed into law in a little over a year from now, fingers crossed, if we, work our legislative magic. But that's an important bill, and I think a step in the right direction. More broadly, though, to your question, I think in California in particular, and especially in the Bay Area, we have to think about our housing policy and our transportation policy together, and then our workforce, right? Because what you have is we have these sort of like, we have San Francisco, everyone's rushing to get in San Francisco all the time. Hopefully with COVID, there's going to be more flexibility on that, and people will spend more time working from home. So they won't have to be going across the bridge or in the tunnel all the time. So that may change, I think, maybe some of our sort of traffic patterns. And I say this all by way of saying, I think about this as like, that's sort of housing and transportation as environmental policy. When we're talking about, how do we reduce 41% of our greenhouse gas is coming out of our exhaust pipes, because we have teachers and firefighters and nurses who are living in Stockton, commuting every day into the Bay Area to work here, and hairdressers and others who can't afford the cost of living. And that's why realtors say, drive till you qualify, start in San Francisco and keep going east until you can qualify for a place, but then you're driving back here, in order to work. And so the more density we have, the less we'll be sort of in our cars. But we do need significant public resources into our public transportation system. And I do still, even though I launched heavily there on the bus system, I still am a big believer in BART. And I also do think we need another Transbay tunnel. And obviously we'll need to look for federal resources for that. But it's sort of an all of the above strategy. The other thing I think we need to do, and I know there's been ongoing conversations about this, is making sure that our public transportation systems are talking more efficiently and effectively. We have a lot of different, I don't know, Ryan probably knows the answer to this. I think it's like 30 something different public transportation systems in the Bay Area. That is a challenge for folks. I know that people are actively working on that, but ensuring there's more a seamless customer experience, as you will, for folks so that they can use these systems more holistically as a whole, as opposed to using all these different separate systems, is another thing that I know that I think is important that we need to tackle.
Mm-hmm. Well, and on that point around transportation and the impacts of mobile sources of pollution, we do have a question that it does seem as though that there are. So the question says, curious, given many refinery workers live and work in your district, what the energy transition means to you. Because it seems that the state is putting all their eggs in the electric car basket, as opposed to an all of the above energy strategy that takes into account the demand for traditional fuels, as well as diverse and innovative mix. So any thoughts about energy transition?
Sure. I mean, this is like, you're hitting on like the third rail of my district here. Bring it on. No, it's a tough question, right? Because it's like, the reality of the matter is, we do have a lot of good high-paying union jobs in the oil and gas industry, right? And that is true. And I've done tours of the refineries, and want to have an understanding of what that means and what that looks like and how those folks' lives are impacted. I also am a big believer that we have to reduce our dependency on oil. And when I look at the realities that we are faced with in not only our state but our country and our world, we are going to have to confront this and do it now in terms of how we reduce our dependency on combustion engines and oil and gas. And when I look at the wildfires, what's happening, and some of you may know my dad fought wildfires as a profession he just basically finished this past year, even though he's been retired for 15 years, he would come out of retirement to help. But we're looking at such a long wildfire season, and a lot of that is because of climate change, and the realities of what all this consumption of oil has done to us. And I think about this as the mom of a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old, and what kind of future we're leaving her. Are we going to be climate refugees here in this state of California? Are we going to be living in 3 or 4 months of toxic, apocalyptic, like smoke, 3 or 4 months out of the year? And what's that going to mean for our economy here in California and our children's, lungs, and all of those big questions? And I don't mean to be so like doomsday about it, but like, we have to really grapple with these things. And so what that looks like, I think, is important. And I think if you talk to most folks that are in the oil and gas industry, either on the sort of at the refineries or, and I've had conversations with my friends at the building trades about this, I think they all understand the reality with which we are going. It's figuring out how and when we sort of, do that transition. But I think it does have to be in mind of that workforce and what those folks do and what that looks like for them. We don't want to make sure that they are, we're thoughtful about what that means for their future livelihood, because they're a part of this community as well. But it also means moving the ball forward and transitioning out of oil and gas.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you for tackling that. I'm so glad that you all keep accepting my invitations, because I try to cover as much, which can feel like you're being grilled, which is not my intention.
You are, and
but you're a substantive person.
I also don't have all the answers, but I'll tell you when I don't know,
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that about you. I mean, and really right out of the chute, the first time we met with you on our Legislative Advocacy Day, I mean, you just really impressed me as someone willing to do the homework and to learn more and to talk to people. So kudos to you. So, but I am an elected school board member. Just going to wear that hat for a hot minute. And so it certainly felt at many points during the pandemic that the governor and the state legislature were leading from behind and really did not, that we were encountering big decisions, and then the state would make the same thing a week later, and we're taking all the slings and arrows around distance learning, around, all that kind of stuff. And so I did want to just get and I understand that JoJo's entering kindergarten at an Oakland Unified School District school.
TK.
Oh, TK. Okay, excellent.
Yes.
Universal TK is coming. So just would love to get your thoughts about how we're doing in education, and where you think we need to do more and do better.
Sure.
Because it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually excited for my daughter to go to Oakland Unified School District, in part because I also think it really helps as a legislator to have my child in the public school system, because I'd be sort of living and breathing it. And, she's been in the ECE world now for the last couple of years, going to preschool. I worked very closely with the ECE providers during the lockdown.
That's early childhood education for the folks that are in different
Yes.
sectors on this call.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes, keep going.
Yes, early childhood education, a lot of our daycares and preschool providers. And, they took a massive hit during COVID, and they weren't, our public school teachers were still paid and still, accommodated for. Our private schools, which is the majority of our early childhood care schools, were not, and many of them have shut down permanently, and it's been a huge hit. And those schools are predominantly women of color and immigrant women who are working in that workforce. And so that's a whole other topic. It's not part of the K through 12 system, which is a whole other topic. But for our littlest ones, they took a big hit. So I say that all by way of saying it was very informative to me as someone who had a child in a preschool environment during COVID, that I understand more firsthand what parents were going through and what the providers were going through. And now I will have that experience as my child starts at Oakland Unified School District. She's going to Emerson TK starting in a couple weeks. But in terms of the state of our education system, a couple things. We have room for improvement. I think everyone would, sort of recognize that. We have increasingly over the last couple of years made much more significant investments in public education. It's still not where it needs to be. I think that this budget helped this year significantly, but we still have room to grow. We do have ethnic and racial disparities within our education system. I hate to say it, if you live in a white zip code, you're going to have better access to quality schools than if you live in a zip code that serves predominantly kids of color. And those racial inequities exist. And they start at a very young age. I mean, women of color get less maternal care. I mean, we're talking, there are racial inequities baked within our system for children from the beginning. And then this plays itself out later in life as we see those inequities in terms of pay, in terms of our criminal justice system, and so on and so forth. And so we have to have real honest conversations about that and recognize those realities, and then think through what are the best evidence-based policies that we can put forth to try to solve some of those problems. And part of that, I think, is our budget, and our budget reflects our values. So as you've seen this year, we invested huge dollars in our ECE, both schools, in terms of providing more subsidized childcare slots, because the waiting list was huge, as well as increasing the reimbursement rates for providers. So that's important. Our early childhood care providers have been unionized over the last year or two, so that it's been a process. It just came to fruition. So I think that helping to sort of professionalize and unionize that workforce, I think, is important. In terms of K through 12, I mean, our K through 12 system just went through an enormous challenge, and going from literally overnight going from in-person to Zoom school for a year and some change, a year and a half for some places, was very difficult and devastating for a lot of students, you know, and I heard about it. I had students and parents calling my, you know, our line and emailing who were having severe mental health challenges with those issues. I had unfortunately students who had committed suicide, you know, and there were so many multitude of issues that kids were faced with. The good news is kids are resilient. It means though that we all have to have a lot of patience and care and understanding, I think, both for our teachers and for our children as we go back to school, and a little bit of patience as we start to like re-enter into kind of what the world looked like. The whole other piece of this too is that with the Delta variant, this is not like settled. It's not like we're like, okay, we're out of COVID, no more COVID, right? Like we still have to deal with this, which is why also I've been pushing hard on mandating vaccines and having employers require proof of vaccination. And I've called for our teachers to do the same, right? I think, I believe if you're on a public school campus, you know, if you are an employee or if you're a teacher, you should be vaccinated. You know, I think children who are eligible, they should be vaccinated. And I think we need to do everything we can to ensure that that happens. So I think, and I will say I had as teachers were dealing with this and the Zoom school and learning how to sort of be a teacher in that environment. And I can't even imagine, like, I feel lucky that my daughter is the age she is, because she could still go to preschool after a couple months. But if she were in kindergarten or first grade trying to Zoom school, like it's got to be so hard for the teachers and so hard for the parents. You know, so I have a lot of sympathy for what they just went through. And I know that they are also eager to get back to in-person learning. We are eager for that to happen. I don't have a lot of patience for Zoom school anymore. Now, I know some people it worked fine for, and we'll continue to have, you know, some kind of a distance learning track for those. But I think the majority of students and the majority of teachers want to be in school, want to get back to as normal as we possibly can. And that's what we as legislators and as the state government should be doing to support them.
Thank you. Appreciate that very much. I am very mindful of the clock too. Assemblymember Wicks has a hard stop that we are going to very much respect. So I'm going to try to get to as many questions and not selfishly use all the time to talk all things K-12. So I do want to go to some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So just wanted to, I'm going to break this up because the person wrote like a question that could take an hour to answer. So
I mean, all of these, to be fair, can take an hour. Yeah.
So what kind of detail can you provide for us on your take on the California comeback plan? And so, and in particular, I'll give you one extra part in terms of business investment and debt relief.
Sure. So the comeback plan, I know Gavin signed this, and it was sort of a combination of a couple different things that were included in it. I know specifically there was the eviction extension piece, and that I think is important in terms of which I think the eviction moratorium extension went through September 30th, you know, and I've heard from all sides on this issue as well, landlords as well as renters. And the goal here is to create a policy where tenants can be protected so that they're not being evicted in times of need, but that landlords aren't losing out on that income that they desperately need, right? And that's the hope, is that we've created a system that will ensure both of those things are true, which benefits sort of everyone. So that was a big piece of it. There was the expanded funding for the second stimulus check, which was, if you look at, I think this question around kind of stimulus money, or right now the federal government's doing CTC, child tax credit money, which is $250 to $300 in people's bank accounts every month starting July through December. If you look at what Stockton did with their money that's going in monthly,
guaranteed income,
guaranteed income, and I look at the sort of stimulus check as a similar vein, or EITC as well, money for people who need it in a way that is no strings attached, especially for low income folks, goes so far. And they will know how to use their money, right? Whether they're going to spend it on diapers or food or rent or whatever it is that they need, those resources are really, really critical. And so I think that was a big piece. And I give kudos to the governor for that second stimulus check that came in. I know that was a piece of it. I think there was almost $1 billion, if I remember correctly, for relief to consumers of community water systems that had past bills due.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think this is important because we had people who I mean, access to water, right? Like that's critical. And then the other piece of it was I think the TK for all 4-year-olds,
Mm-hmm.
which is going to be, I think, signed into law. And that bill's, it's not without controversy. Some of the early childhood care community doesn't really support the bill. I'm a supporter of the bill. I think access to TK for 4-year-olds is an important piece of the equation, but those were some of the main pieces of the California sort of comeback plan. I think what you're looking at is funding in terms of housing, cash in people's pockets who need it, making sure people have access to water, and then that sort of TK piece kind of holistically served as, I think, an important vision for how we can come back as a state.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. So
yes,
thank you for hitting on some of those bigger pieces. So another question we got in advance is, how do you see the issue of data privacy and broadband infrastructure moving forward in our local cities?
Sure. So on the, I kind of view those as two separate things. So let me just sort of, I'll separate those. When you look at, in the Bay Area, it's not as, the lack of access to broadband is not as bad as it is in some of our rural communities for obvious reasons. And I come from a rural community. I grew up in Forest Hill, which no one knows where that's at, but it's outside Auburn on the way to Lake Tahoe and like Trump's America. Although it's very beautiful, but it's very politically conservative. And somehow they had me and like my gay brother who lives in Berkeley. So, progressives do come out of the region. But I will say one of my colleagues, Cecile Aguiar-Curry, who's fantastic. She's really led on this broadband question and pushed for the past couple of years. She's been in office on broadband access to all, which became very profound as we saw during the pandemic. And I know so I represent both Contra Costa County and parts of Contra Costa and parts of Alameda. And I know in Contra Costa County, I think it's 72% of households have access to broadband when it could be 98%. And so that's not a small amount of folks. And I think in Alameda, it's 68% have access when it could be 99%. And so we still have broadband issues. People don't think of it as much in the Bay Area, but it totally exists. And so the governor put forth, I think, $6 billion into broadband infrastructure, which I think will be huge. And, to me, this is like a basic infrastructure question, and access to, reliable and fast and affordable internet is key. And we saw this with school closures, and we saw families who didn't have tablets, didn't have access to broadband, were using cell phones. And obviously that was sort of a perfect storm of a problem. But through that, hopefully now we've learned that this is a critical piece of the infrastructure, and we will use this pandemic as a moment to really fundamentally rebuild this piece of our infrastructure and actually have significant, improvements there on the broadband. On the privacy front, I sit on the privacy committee, and this is, I think, one of the more like sort of intellectually interesting committees I sit on, because of the way, sort of the last sort of 20 years in terms of how we consume information, what we have about ourselves out there in the world, what this looks like, who has access to that information, how do advertisers use that information, how can we have control of our own data as an individual, and on our rights to our own privacy and our rights to our own data. The legislature has done some pretty groundbreaking work in the last couple of years in that space, followed by the proposition that was just on the ballot this past year around the question of data, and we've created a new agency to enforce this. But basically the idea that you have the right to know what companies know about you, you have the right to delete that data, which is important, and you have the right to sort of opt out of companies collecting your data. And obviously we've seen this play out significantly in Facebook and the dialogue around there. I think we're still like at the tip of the spear in like this brave new world around data. And I know our federal government is grappling with a lot of these questions too. And I think it speaks to a broader question around, the power of a lot of the tech companies, and I think it's a double-edged sword. The tech industry in the Bay Area is a huge wealth generator, and there's great high-paying jobs. We want high-paying jobs in our region. That's important for us to have, while at the same time it asks questions around, antitrust laws. Do those need to be updated? And these broader questions around data privacy. One of the places that I've personally focused in on this is around data and the sort of online experience for kids. And I did a bill this year called the Kids Act, which got held, but I'll do it again. And I'm really informed by my own experience as a parent with my 4-year-old. But she'll say, "Mommy, can I watch something on the tablet?" And I'm like every other parent, I'm busy doing things. And so I'll give her a certain amount of time she can be on the tablet. And, she'll go on. I try not to let her do YouTube because it's a little bit like the Wild West, but sometimes she'll just sneak onto YouTube and, she'll start in one place, like watching like Thomas Train or whatever, and ends in a very different place because of the algorithms. So it's like this sort of, how do we put more parameters around kids' content? How do we do things like really address like autoplay? Because they'll sit there and they'll go from one show to the next, to the next, to the next. And as a parent, that's really difficult. The other part of my bill was to disallow for in-app purchases on kids' apps because they could go online and buy stuff, And so I just think we need more parameters, especially for our children. Parents need the help. I need the help as a parent, to help create a safer space for her. And so hopefully that stuff will evolve, but I like the idea of her having her own cell phone. I'm like, when is she going to start asking for that? Like, can we not have that happen? But I know it happens at a younger age. So those are things I'll confront as a parent. I won't legislate that. Don't worry. But I do think it's important to have like guardrails around how kids are online in particular.
Well, I appreciate that. My kids are 16 and 13. JoJo's going to have a driver's license before you know it.
When did you get them a cell phone? That's what I want to know.
Okay. Well, we do have very precious time, but I would say 7th grade for one, 6th grade for another.
Okay.
And briefly earlier than that, because we kind of did a funny babysitting thing, our older watching our younger one. But so we're surviving on that. But again, happy to talk more offline. So I'm going to be in trouble with Alex Evans from HNTV if I don't ask his question, which is kind of a simple one. Will the legislature support the release of the $4.2 billion in bond money for high-speed rail?
I mean, so first of all, there's no simple one.
Okay, stipulated.
This is part of the work that we need to do when we return. And so we'll see where it lands. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. And I will say that amongst the conversations I've had with some of my colleagues, there's been I support high-speed rail, so it's a little bit easier for me, but there's a lot of concern around the project and what has happened. And, I think the obvious issues that have been raised in the public, and making sure that we are good guardians of money and that the money is being spent, wisely, and all of those questions. And so I don't know. I don't know if the legislature is going to support it or not. I think time will tell. So it's not simple. And you'll have to just tune in when we get returned to see how that shakes out. I cannot predict the legislature's future there.
Okay. So I love what Lara Delaney, who's an elected member of the Martinez City Council and also works for Contra Costa County. She posed the question, why are so many of the housing production related bills not advancing despite the housing crisis and stated desire of legislature to support production? I've got my theories, but I would love to know yours.
So this is like a $64,000 question that a lot of us grapple with in the legislature. And there's a handful of us who are constantly pushing on production bills. And then there's the reality that we don't pass them, right? And some of them, and I've passed some, but frankly, even the bills I've passed they've been important and good. I don't want to undersell myself, but they're at the margins, right? We're kind of moving to the margins. I think we have work to do with some of our Los Angeles colleagues, which I think is important. And they have a different sort of situation down in LA that needs to be considered. So I think that's a piece of it. There has been some challenges, frankly, which has been reported about, with the affordable housing developers and the building trades and sort of the ongoing sort of negotiations there that are continuing to take place. And I know with the sort of announcement that Robbie Hunter is no longer going to be head of building trades, I think we'll see kind of how that shakes out and shapes up. And but I do have faith that we can kind of come to agreement there. You have some third rail issues within that context of things like CEQA reform, right? That again, these are the third part of the third rail of housing politics, which I think fundamentally are going to need to be addressed. How do we ensure that, CEQA is used for its true intent of, ensuring that our communities are, safeguarded, while at the same time not used sometimes for nefarious purposes, right? And so I think that's an important thing that needs to be, thought through. And then I think you raised this earlier, but your kind of classic Nimbyism. You have folks who they like the community just the way it is, and I think don't want to see a ton of change and feel like they bought into this community, whether it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, because they like it the way it is and they don't want to see it change and feel concerned about, what new development could mean. And then I think you have a group of people who are legitimately and honestly concerned about gentrification and the fact that we have, a lot of our brown and Black communities getting pushed out. And so how are they a part of the equation as well in the discussion to make sure that there's an equity lens in terms of how things are looked through. And so you have a lot of different interests. You've got the building trades and the affordable housing developers and your market rate developers and your tenants' rights advocates and, equity groups and, NIMBYs and YIMBYs and, a lot of different competing interests and the realtors and the apartment associations who have very strong lobby in Sacramento. And so getting a bill through with all of those different interests at mind is not easy. And I try to work with all of them, frankly, with the goal of how do we, increase housing production, or else we're going to continue to, we're going to lose people in this state, and when we talk, you asked about education, how are educators going to afford living in these communities? How are our teachers and our ECE providers going to afford living in Oakland and Berkeley? Like they're not, is the reality. And, so we have to address the issue. And I think it just means, really trying to have honest conversations with people, trying to make deals where you can and trying to move the bills forward.
All right, I'm going to use my point of privilege with 1 minute left before you have to take off. If you were all powerful, what's the one thing you would do for California?
Oh my God. I mean, that's such a good question. I am worried about our longer term climate change issues and the sort of livability of California vis-a-vis, what climate's going to do to the state and how we need to bring together our housing and transportation policy towards that end of figuring out that question. And I know that kind of involves a multitude of things, but that does worry me and keeps me up at night, when I think about the future of the state of California and how we can continue to lead and be, a leader in the world on some of these issues. I think that's probably that. I don't know. There's so many.
No, there are so many. Thank you for your leadership on vaccines and for pushing employers. You need to go. I'm going to say a few more things.
Can I just say, if you're an employer, can you please require your employees to be vaccinated and show proof of vaccination?
Yeah, lots of our member companies have already done that. Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll continue to push that.
I will tweet out all the good things that you guys are doing if you have companies, and I want to work with them to help highlight the goodness that they're doing in that space.
Okay, perfect. Well, we will keep that up. And good luck this afternoon. And
thank you.
I really just want to thank Assemblymember Wicks for joining us. Thank all of you for joining us. And certainly, as I offer to all of our elected legislators to participate in our Capitol series, that the East Bay Leadership Council stands at the ready to partner with our legislators to improve our state and to make sure that we take the best ideas and that we fund what works, that we stop funding what doesn't work, and that we attack some of the regulations that make it hard if you want to start a new career and need to get licensed. California has some of the most expensive and arduous requirements for shifting your career. So there's so much that we can tackle and that we need to work on together. So thank you so much for joining us. As always, let us know how we can improve these and other events. And please be sure to check out eastbayleadershipcouncil.com for all the latest events and news about our task forces. One other plug, if you're interested in running for office or know someone who should, please have them sign up for our candidate training program at buildthebench.com. So thank you to our leading members. Thanks again to Assemblymember Wicks. And with that, we are adjourned.